So this week, it's one of our popular sessions on running workshops, various sessions we've done in the past, tips and tricks and so on. So in this one, what I wanted to do was kind of just take us a little bit of a different angle for thinking about workshops, and breaking it down into sort of key do's and don'ts, things to make sure that you definitely do, and things to try and avoid. So what I've done is I've got 3 do's and 3 don'ts, but they are not in any particular order, so they're a little bit mixed up. But I'll walk through these, and then if we've got any questions at the end, then by all means you can ask then. So as it says on the screen, let's get started. So my first one is a do, and so this hopefully should be common sense to most people, anyone running a process workshop, but it is come prepared. So there's lots and lots of things you can do to prepare yourself for a process workshop, but what I've done here is pulled out what I think are some of the key things to remember. And some of these things, although they might seem quite obvious, I have been involved in workshops where this hasn't been done, and it's been a little bit difficult. Ultimately, for me, being prepared for a workshop is about being able to go straight into the room. When I say room, that could be a physical room or it might be a Teams meeting, and to be able to dive straight into the conversation or the discussion about the process. What you don't want to have, or the situation you want to try and avoid, is where you've got a group of stakeholders and subject matter experts, you get them into a room, and then you spend 10-15 minutes messing around trying to get the screen working, or having a bit of a discussion about what process you're going to map. The thing is that stakeholders and subject matter experts are very busy. They've got full-time jobs to work at. So the more prepared you can be before you start the workshop, the better use of their time you can make. And generally people will appreciate it if you can do that. So a few key things just to kind of highlight here for me is, why do you need this process map now? So what's the question that you're trying to answer by mapping this process at this particular point in time? Now, I put a couple of examples on. There are often very different things in here. One of the things I've put on there is process improvement, but that itself could be broken down into lots of different things. Might be that you're aware that there's a problem in the process, but you don't really know what it is or what the root cause of it is. It might be actually that you don't really know about any particular problems in a given process, but the organization has a strategic initiative to look at how they could improve customer experience or reduce cost, or something like that. So you're actually embarking on some sort of project without knowing exactly where it's going to lead you just yet. The important thing is that when you start that workshop, or even before, when you invite people into it, that you're all clear about why you're asking for the stakeholders' time to come and join you. So be clear about it. And one of the tips that I've often used in different organizations I've worked at is, when we actually go into the workshop and we've got your Spark up on the screen ready to start the conversation, actually putting like a sticky note box at the top with that question. We're here today to identify the requirements because we're upgrading this system, or whatever it is. Again, the more specific you can be, the better it is. It helps people prepare, helps them think about it, and helps focus in the workshop. Second option the second point I've got made on there is what's in scope for the workshop. So it kind of leads on from that piece, but it's kind of the next level of detail down. So it's then about, okay, which process or which part of a process specifically are we looking at? And again, those of you who come to these sessions often, you'll know the common things we talk about. What is the name of the process you're going to map? Sounds really obvious, but often people use names or language or terminology which can be a little bit vague or ambiguous, and therefore what happens is people start to think you're talking about different processes are not clear or aligned on exactly what process it is. So you can help that by making sure that you identify and understand where the process starts and where it finishes. That will help you to focus in the workshop as well. It's easy to then say to people, we're not interested in what happens before that or what happens it after. We're only looking at what's happening between these 2 points. But again, it helps to clarify exactly what process that we're there to map. And then one which I've often talked about in the past is, which I think is a really powerful one for getting people to really clarify what exactly they're being asked to describe, is to come up with a process purpose statement. Now that could be quite lengthy, but I always recommend a 1 or 2 sentence statement. It just tries to highlight why we need this process and what value. So who is the customer of the process and what is it they value about the process? That helps everyone to focus on what they need to actually get out of it and talk about within the process. And then other things like, who is it you're going to invite to the workshop? Who's the process owner? Who are the stakeholders, subject matter experts? And those sorts of things. You might not be able to invite everybody to a workshop because you might just not have the space. And you might consider a limit to the number of people that you would invite to the workshop. I've found personally that a sort of 8 to 10 people in a workshop is kind of the ultimate, optimal number. Any more than that, and it starts to get much more difficult to manage. Not impossible, but it becomes much more difficult to manage. So sometimes, if you've got a big group of stakeholders and SMEs, you then have to think carefully about who you're going to invite. The last bit I've got down there is have you got everything ready? Again, hopefully this is just common sense, but have you scheduled the meeting? Are the meetings in the diary? Have you booked the room if it's a room? Is the equipment working? If you're using Teams or Zoom or whatever, are you familiar with the necessary controls that you're going to need to use? Do you need to get refreshments ready? That sort of thing. So hopefully that some of these are common sense, but I've always found worth reinforcing, because there's nothing worse than getting a meeting invite into your diary to say they're going to map a process and you don't really know why you're mapping that, what they're actually asking, what the process is, or anything like that. So that was do number 1. The next thing I'm going to jump to, which again I think is a really important one that I see time and time again, is a don't this time. And the way I've described this is, don't stare endlessly at a blank page. So when you go into the room, the challenge is often that if you you start the discussion and wait for something to emerge before you start putting anything onto the page or onto the screen, you'll find that conversation can go on for a long time and it will often circle back. It becomes a sort of circular conversation. People start talking about the same thing again without resolving anything. And that's often because it's hard to remember everything you've just talked about if it's not being captured or documented for you visually or otherwise. So it's much better to just start putting boxes onto the page, start putting stuff into them as people are describing stuff. Just put it in there, even if it feels like it might be out of scope or it might be too detailed or whatever. Just start putting stuff on there, because it's much easier to remove stuff. It's much easier to criticize or discuss stuff if it's on the page than if it isn't. So it doesn't matter if it's wrong, because you can remove it if it's wrong. And just to help sort of facilitate that as well, I find even something as simple as just putting empty boxes onto the page will help people start to think about what they're going to put in those boxes. And remember, nice thing with Spark is that you put the box on the page, it's got the question in it. So that in itself is starting to stimulate people's thoughts. You put a group of activity boxes on the page with the question, what happens in it? People will start to think about, okay, what's happening in this process, and start to talk about it. So don't stare at a blank page. Start putting stuff onto the page as soon as possible. Put stuff in the boxes, even if it's wrong, because it's easier to remove it than it is to put it there in the first place. Right, next one, I've got another don't, and that is, so once you're in the workshop, don't allow one person to dominate the discussion. Easier said than done. as a facilitator, you've got to try and manage this sort of situation that when it comes up. Now, it can happen for different reasons. A good example that I've experienced myself more than once is where you get a senior person in the room and they just sort of take over the conversation, or everyone else doesn't feel comfortable saying anything, and so they just let the senior person talk. So a couple of things I've got, or suggestions here to help manage that sort of thing. I think very simple level, and again, something I've found very useful over the years, is to set ground rules. So have a simple set of ground rules that you can get people to agree at the beginning of the workshop. And then if people start to deviate or get difficult to manage, you can point them back to the ground rules and say, really useful. I've got things on here that are really around trying to avoid this situation where you might get one person dominating the discussion. So try to make it clear that everyone in the room is equal. If you think there's a cultural challenge where that's not possible, um, one of the things that I've done in the past is I've had the senior person come in, do an intro, set the scene, and then basically leave and say to people, you've got this freedom to say what you want. Anything, if you say anything that's controversial or whatever, it stays in the room. It's not going to be shared with anyone. It's all about kind of getting people to feel comfortable to talk about the process. Again, simple tools like if discussions start to go off on tangents or take too long, then have a timeout, have a flip chart or somewhere where you can capture those things as action so you can pick them up after the workshop if necessary. And another one that I found useful actually really feeds into the next point, but this idea that silence equals assent. So the idea behind this is if you don't say anything, then we're making the assumption that you are agreeing with the rest of the group. Now, you need to set that expectation as a ground rule at the beginning of the workshop so that people are clear that's what your expectation is. Now, you can use that then when you're trying to involve people in the workshop. So basically what we need to do, if you do have a situation where someone is starting to dominate, as a facilitator, you need to try and bring other people and get them involved in the conversation. So here is my suggestions of things like trying to ask those people questions to get them to input, but again, making sure they understand that if they don't say anything, the assumption is they agree. Then as you're mapping the process, you can keep stopping and saying, okay, does everyone agree? And if they don't say anything, the assumption is that they agree. And you can remind them of the ground rule if necessary. But again, if you've got someone who's sitting there not saying a great deal, every now and again picking that, or there's normally more than one, but picking those people out and saying, okay, well, what do you think? Do you agree? Does this sound right to you? So it's about giving them a chance to have some input. One thing I just realised one of my ground rules is missing is that I normally use is only one person speaks at a time, which again is really important. But it does mean that if you've got someone dominating you, sometimes you have to kind of interrupt them or ask them to just sort of pause while you do something else to bring other people in. Another one of the things that will often drive a perception that it's being dominated by one person is how different people see the process. So the way I've called it here is the 50,000 foot view versus the detail. Now, sometimes you'll get someone who goes, right, well, this process is easy. It's you do this step, this step, this step, and then this step, and it's done. The next person that you ask, how does the process work? They'll go, right, well, the first thing I do is I turn my computer on, then I log in, then I open the system, then I go to this screen, then I'll click on this button. They think about the process in a lot of detail. When that person starts, it often will take them quite a long time to describe all the detailed steps to get to a certain point. So to some extent, you have to allow them to play that out because you don't want to interrupt them too early and put them off because they'll have something valuable to say. But it's also a good point to just chuck what they're saying onto boxes, onto the canvas, even if it feels very detailed or low level. You can always move it into a detailed view. So you can move that stuff into a detailed view and then return to the higher level and walk through the process at a higher level. And time again, what I found is that those people who like the detail will, as long as they see that you've been capturing some of it as you've been going, when they then see the high level and how you think about the process that way, they then become quite comfortable because they know that you're going to come back to it in the detail in the other detailed views. Okay, so next up, we've got another do. And again, this is a really useful one for me. This is something that I learned years and years ago and have used this time and time again. But this is all about having a structure for your workshop. I've called it have a plan for the workshop. Having done your prep, making sure you know what process it is, having your start and end point, got your key stakeholders, your process purpose. This is then about how do you structure the conversation, control the workshop, manage the ebb and flow of the conversation. And actually, there's a couple of things in here which can also help with that situation where you get someone who dominates the discussion. So we call it the 5-step approach. Sometimes we call it the 5 steps to the perfect process, but it's just a really nice, simple, structured way to guide that conversation. Now, step 1, you'll recognize already, define the title and scope of the process. So that's the name of the process plus the start and the end point. But after that, this is where it gets interesting. So again, first thing we do is just focus on the activities in the process. So remember what I said, just put some boxes onto the page, put some empty activity boxes onto the page. Don't join them up, just put the activity boxes and ask people to describe what the main steps in the process are. Generally, people find it quite easy to describe the steps in the process. What they'll find much harder is the next one, step 3, which is then starting to think about the outputs. So in the situation where you've got someone who might be dominating the conversation, you can use the outputs to help hold them up, because you can say, you can interrupt them and go, oh, could you just pause there? So that last step that you were just describing there, how do you know when that's finished? What do you have at the end of it? And that normally causes people to pause and think and reflect. Now, sometimes you might have to do that earlier than in here. Recommendation with the 5-step approach is you get all the activities for the process first, then you come back and you start thinking about the outputs. Once you've done the outputs, then you go back to the beginning of the process and you start to talk about who are the roles that are doing each step and what systems you have. And then again, you go back and you start to capture other information. For example, if your question you're trying to answer is driving you down the route of capturing requirements, you would do that then. So the nice thing about this is, first of all, because you focus on activities first, it gets people talking, it gets the discussion flowing. Then you go to outputs, it slows things down. People become more reflective, think more deeply about the process, and start to suggest things that are wrong with it, improvements, and so on. Then they start to get clarity about who does what, roles and responsibilities, and so on. The second thing that's really important about this process is it's iterative. So you run through the process via the activities first, then you do it again describing the outputs, then you do it again describing the roles and systems and so on. And each time you do that, you often find someone will say, oh, we've forgotten this step, or we've forgotten that. So it's really good at getting a really good representation of the process. What I should say, though, is that when you're doing this, if you are mapping a multi-level process, so you're summarizing it on one level, then you follow this process for that level at that time, and then you start with each drill down. So you'd go down into the details and then essentially follow the same 5-step approach at that point too. Okay, next on my list of do's and don'ts. So don't make it your process. Okay, and by this I mean if sometimes this can be hard, because sometimes you are completely involved in the process, but you're trying to map it at the same time. This is especially true, though, if you are facilitating or mapping a process on behalf of a group of stakeholders. What you've got to be careful of is that your job is to facilitate that conversation, not to describe the process. as the facilitator and or mapper in that situation, you basically have control over what is going into the process map. Now, if you start to inject how you think the process should work or what you believe the process to be in that, there's a danger that people are just sitting there watching you map a process as you think it is and not the process that they believe or understand it to be. And that can really put people off. They'll just sit there and go, well, you're not listening to me, so I'm just not going to say anything else. So, that job is all about listening to what people say. Now, what you do have to do is you have to listen to what they say, and then you have to kind of sometimes reframe or rephrase what they've told you in a way that can be then put into a process. So redescribing an activity using a verb and noun construct to make it easier to follow and understand. Whatever it is, you're still going to walk through the process with the stakeholders afterwards and get them to agree to it. But you're certainly able to make suggestions. So again, going back to the first point about don't stare at a blank page, if you haven't quite understood what they're describing, put some things up there, give them different options, ask them to choose which one is most like is what you're describing or what's closest to what you're describing and so on. Again, it's easier to put something up there and have people criticize it and take it off afterwards. Or presenting something and go, what if it looked like this? Does it make sense? I've had that often before where people are really get to a point where they're struggling to articulate or describe something, and you're finding it difficult to understand what they're saying for the same reason. And then you go, well, what if it looked like this? Does that make sense? And then people go, oh yeah, that's it. We just change that line to there, or that output goes to that place instead, and move on. And then my last one here, which is another do, and that is do follow up with people afterwards. So if you've mapped a process in Spark, one of the easiest things for you to do right at the end of a workshop is to share the process with people. You might want to do a little bit of tidying up, cleaning at the end. Just don't overdo it. One of the benefits, powerful benefits of mapping a process straight into a tool like Spark in a workshop is that when people leave the workshop and see the process again, it looks very, very similar to what they agreed when they were in the room. There's nothing worse than them agreeing to a process that has been mapped in one format, for example, whiteboards and sticky notes. You've taken a photograph of that, then you transferred it into a digital format and you send that out to people and they say, well, that didn't look like what I remembered in the workshop. It's much more difficult for that, or much less likely for that to happen if what they see afterwards is virtually the same as what they agreed to in the workshop. But send out links to the process, ask for feedback, because if you just send them a link, there's a good chance people don't even bother to click on it. Whereas if you're asking people for feedback, asking them for help to make sure the process is correct, people are more likely to click through, check it through, and leave feedback that could be useful. The iterative nature of the 5-step approach that I mentioned before is really good for making sure you don't miss stuff, but you'll always miss something. Like, it will never be perfect. People always tend to remember something when they leave the workshop. So again, it's a good opportunity for people to do that. And then if you have captured any action, so if you did have to time out during the workshop because of a conversation that was going off track, or you agreed specific actions to be done, or common one that I see is that there's a question comes up and no one really understands how a particular part of the process works or what outputs expected at some point. Maybe somebody wasn't able to attend that has that information, questions that need to be answered, so on. Just make sure that you manage that, you assign owners to them, and you follow up to make sure those actions happen. Otherwise, people just think that you've taken their time to do the workshop, and then they never hear from you again, and they just, well, that was a waste of time. So make sure there's an element of communication afterwards.